The Nerdcast Empire is on the air. We are back for another week of podcasting excellence on this Sunday. Great to have you along with us once again. I am Matt in the studio. Great to have you joining us for another episode of the Nerdcast Empire. Joining me in the studio once again is Mike. Mike, how's it going?
I am here once again. It is going all right.
Sounds good. Always great to have you here in the studio. Joining us from Parts Unknown, and different Parts Unknown this time than the last time we had a chance to chat with him. But I think in the original Parts Unknown now, it is Chris. Chris, how's it going?
I've returned to the expected Parts Unknown, we'll call it.
The expected Parts Unknown. Chris has returned to those places, and we'll get his thoughts in a moment. We're going to be talking video games this week, some video game news, some upcoming games, what Mike and Chris have been playing, because they've primarily been the ones playing video games. We'll talk about some other games that may be coming out soon that they want to check out, and then we'll close up talking about a subscription service that Mike has signed up for and kind of get into that on this week's episode. So let's talk about some news in the gaming world. I think the biggest news, Mike, we'll start out with you, is the news that's kind of leaked out. And I think if it hasn't been confirmed, it certainly will be. Everybody's talking about almost nonstop for the last 3 or 4 months. When's the Switch 2 coming out? Should I buy a Switch 1? I think there's so many Reddit posts about, should I buy a Switch 1 with Switch 2 coming out? I was one of the people that just bought a Switch for the first time. But it sounds like the Switch 2 or whatever is going to follow the initial Switch is not going to be coming out this year.
Yeah, it's funny because over the years, the story, a couple of years ago, it was, are we going to get a Switch Pro, like some sort of mid-tier upgraded version? We did eventually get the OLED, but that wasn't really a step up beyond kind of the screen. But yeah, a leak that was reported by Game Rant suggests now that the Switch 2 could be announced by June with a planned release in the first quarter of 2025. Kind of going into the year, we were really kind of expecting maybe like a holiday 2024 release, I believe. So the fact that they pushed it a little further down the road, the original Switch is still performing well as far as sales go. So maybe they're not in so much of a hurry, but from a performance hardware end side of it, I'm certainly anxious for the next system to come out.
I think if Nintendo is going to keep up, I know Nintendo's generally been okay with maybe having a little bit less in the way of the hardware performance side in exchange for games that are much more fun to play, group play, things like that. And obviously the big AAA franchises, if you will, your Marios and things like that, Pokemon, obviously, they've been kind of okay with maybe their system not really performing well, but you're also now releasing games that you're pushing the limits of that, and in some cases exceeding that. And I think if they're going to continue to get that gaming market at a time where video gaming is once again really hot, you'd better find a way in that next version of the Switch to beef it up a little bit so that it can handle whatever it's doing now and whatever's still to come.
Yeah, and I think even the most recent Pokemon game, Scarlet and Violet, I'd mentioned before playing the Dragon Quest Monsters game that just came out a few months ago. There's a noticeable slowdown when you're playing it. It's you obviously Pokemon would never be on another system, but something like Dragon Quest, it's like, man, I really hope they release this on the PS5 at some point, just so I know there's no lag or the frames just totally crash on you. It's interesting because Nintendo, I don't even think the Switch is considered a current generation system. I don't think it doesn't sit in that same market segment as your PS5 and Xbox Series X. But since Nintendo has the most powerful first party lineup, they've kind of always been able to get away with that.
I think at some point that's going to catch up to them. I think, who knows? Maybe not. Maybe because of the titles they have, maybe they continue to get away with it. Chris, any thoughts on the Switch, potentially a new Switch, what you would like to see, what might come next from Nintendo?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about it potentially catching up to them, but I almost kind of hope it doesn't. We've lived in this world for so long where people just expect a new console to come out after a little while, but you wonder if we won't hit a point where there's a limit to the specifications, and maybe we're getting close to that. And Nintendo's gotten away with not requiring, the high-end specifications just because they focus solely on the game and the titles that they have. So I think if anyone's going to break that pattern, it's going to be Nintendo.
Yeah, definitely. It'll be interesting to see where that kind of goes going forward, but that'll be still to come. Obviously, when we get more confirmed details on that, we'll certainly share them here on the podcast. Other news, of course, it's the kind of the time of year we're starting to get some new releases being announced, and certainly curious to hear your guys' thoughts on some of the new releases. Start with you, Mike, on some things that has been announced that maybe people should be excited about.
Yeah, one of the things that they announced at that Nintendo Partner Direct that came out a couple weeks ago, they're kind of coming out with an upgraded version of the Shin Megami Tensei 5 game. This one called Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance. And kind of to my earlier point, thankfully that'll be coming to multiple systems. So I think that was another game that had some performance issues on the Switch. So I'll definitely be looking to pick that up on PS5. I've not yet been able to get around to the game itself yet, but I know there's DLC for Elden Ring coming out that people are pretty excited about. And then for me, probably my next big game that I'm looking into will be Final Fantasy VII Rebirth on the 29th.
Yeah, it'll be big. I know everybody's been talking about that, and we've seen the trailers for it. It looks amazing, so I can't wait to see you check it out. I have not played many Final Fantasy games. I certainly appreciate watching them, but it's not a franchise I've really gotten into. But I do know somebody who's into Elden Ring, and that is Chris. Chris, your thoughts on the new upgrades to Elden Ring coming soon, and anything else you're interested in?
We got the gameplay trailer for Shadow of the Earth series. Excited about that. And more importantly, we got a release date, Friday, the 21st of June. So that's kind of put a time frame on my beating of the original game. I've kind of been lax on that. Excited for that. There's a lot of speculation about the map and how big it's going to be compared to the original, but with how long it's taken and the history behind the Souls games, you know they put a lot of work into it. Going into some other franchises, I know Dragon's Dogma is about to have a sequel coming up next month. So I never got to play the original. I've heard only good things about it. And I mean, looking at reviews of the original game, even to this day, people say that it still holds up. So I may have to pull that down. I know I have it in my library. It's kind of gathering dust. So I definitely want to check that out and see what I can get into before the sequel drops.
Yeah, there's a lot of really big titles there people are going to be really excited about. And another thing we want to talk about with video games is, of course, the most recent Pokemon Day, which just happened. And there's always some interesting news coming out of Pokemon Day. And I think maybe more of the news this year was what wasn't said as much as what was said. But I know you've got kind of a recap of what did happen and kind of the reaction to that based on the recent Pokemon Day.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. If you follow along online, there are so many people who claim to get leaks or rumor sites or whatever that are just constantly telling you what's going to be announced and then why it turns out that wasn't announced when it doesn't end up happening. Yeah, there was a lot of speculation about some new games being announced. And honestly, it not to say it fell flat, because I know a lot of people who are really into Pokemon enjoyed the announcements. But yeah, February 27th was Pokemon Day. They had their big Pokemon Presents Direct. And really the biggest announcement, which I'm kind of excited about, is a new Legends game, Pokemon Legends Z to A.
And that'll be coming out next year, correct?
Yeah, that is scheduled for 2025. So it's, even though it was announced, it's still a ways away. It'll be interesting to see if that lands on new Switch hardware or if we're still, I assume the new Switch is going to have backward compatibility. So it's kind of interesting to see how that's going to turn out.
I think there's been a lot of news about Pokemon this year just because of the wild success of Pal World and a lot of the things that it does, and whether it is ripping off Pokemon, whether it's doing some of the things that maybe Pokemon should try to do. I'm curious how people are kind of perceiving I don't want to say lack of news, because there wasn't a lack of news. It's just there's nothing that's going to be in the immediate future for Pokemon within the next 6 months to a year, and how people are kind of taking that, because there is a lot of excitement around some other games that have maybe kind of taken some of the market share from Pokemon.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people, and I would probably count myself in this, would kind of like to see Pokemon take their time for the next main line, the next generational release, and really try to do something different. Scarlet and Violet was the first fully open world game, which was kind of cool, but it had performance issues. The actual story, gameplay, NPCs, I think it kind of fell flat in those regards. We'll see what they do from here. I know there are certain things that Pal World does that you just won't see in a Pokemon game, and I think we're all fine with that. I don't know how much of a survivability element you want to add to Pokemon when this game's probably going to be played by 8 and 9-year-olds. But I do think there's got to be some new wrinkle, some innovation that they can add that they just haven't really explored yet. And I don't know what that is, but there has to be something.
I think the other thing that you pointed out, and we talked about this before, that is important to note is you mentioned already the new Switch is coming at some point. We don't really know when. We believe it's sometime in early 2025, but presumably it's going to get at the very least some level of performance upgrade. It's going to get more RAM. It's going to be able to outperform the current Switch. So in some regards, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for them to rush out a bunch of new games that they could wait another 6 months to a year on and maybe be able to do a lot cooler things when they have a better platform to work with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the last I'd heard, they were kind of comparing what they believe to be the specs on the new Switch to that of like a PS4, which tells you a lot about what the Switch is working with presently. Yeah, and I would imagine if you're a developer with Nintendo, you're really excited about pushing that envelope a little farther and seeing what you can create. It's interesting when you talk about just the gaming industry in general, because I feel like while Nintendo gets maligned a lot, and probably by me occasionally, for having kind of substandard hardware by comparison, theirs is also the one that is least like just a gaming PC. Like there is a gimmick to it. And I think that's something they would rather lean into as opposed to having just the highest power system.
I think there's a lot of talk lately about these new, whether it's PS5 or Xbox Series X. Are you better off just to get a really awesome gaming PC, which you're going to spend a little more on, obviously, but it can do so much more. Some of these gaming consoles are almost underpowered PCs compared to your high-end gaming PCs.
That's something where Sony really needs to figure out some gimmick or something that they can bring to the table, because with Xbox, Microsoft already has PC covered. I mean, if you have Game Pass, you're gaming on your PC and your system, so that transition away from hardware would be a lot easier for them than it would be for Sony.
Could be interesting to see if Sony isn't careful, if they don't get left behind in the PC gaming world, because you know that PC specs just continue to go up and up and up. And as prices come down on components, you just get to see more and more ridiculous games show up on top of just your average, cheap, quick to market type games that we're seeing flood the streaming markets now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope that's more of what we see in the future just in general, because I think the days of spending $300 million on a game and just hoping people buy it to somehow break even, I don't know how that's sustainable. And you see a lot of the layoffs in the gaming industry now, and I think we're finally starting to see that come to roost, essentially.
Well, you better have a big name title if you're going to spend that kind of money, because otherwise you are taking a large gamble with not only the future of your company, but potentially the future employment of your staff. So you'd better be sure before you take that big a swing at it. But
yeah, absolutely.
we've talked a lot about releases. There are a lot of things that are out, new stuff, old stuff. Obviously, you guys are primary gamers on the Nerdcast Empire. So we'll start with Chris. What have you been into lately? Obviously, I think both of you are really kind of playing some older catalog things that have been out that you've been wanting to get into. What's been on your agenda lately as far as video gaming?
As far as I'm concerned, I've been playing a lot of Power World. I know that's one of the big new ones that's come out, and rightfully so. A lot of debate when it first dropped as far as AI being used and how similar it was to Pokemon. But honestly, what I've been able to play of it differentiates itself enough. And I think it's definitely going to put a lot of companies, AAA companies, on notice. It has a lot to offer, lots of replayability, and I've had a blast playing it with my friends. As far as older titles, which I'm more prone to play, I've been trying to pick up my playthrough of the Yakuza series. Anyone that hasn't checked it out, I highly recommend it. Your kind of classic Sega beat 'em up. It's almost like they put Streets of Rage into a 3D realm. It crosses over into Japanese culture, Yakuza crime families. So you kind of get a taste of what the Eastern life is like. Great stories. I will say that you're going to run into a little bit of whiplash. A lot of the side quests that you're going to go on throughout the games are going to flash as they're more comedic compared to the main story of the games. But that's part of why they're such a gem, is just some of the comedy that they're able to throw in throughout the gameplay. Not sure if either of you have ever looked into the gameplay of Yakuza, but I highly recommend it.
I've seen some people talk about it online on YouTube, some of the YouTube videos. I think I've even seen like a VTuber play it as well. And it does seem really interesting. It's not something I've played really, but I could see where it would be really popular series.
You kind of get a view of host clubs, cabaret clubs. There's a couple games where you get to run them yourself. Some of the old school karaoke bars, batting cages. There's so many mini games to play in the series that it's almost a separate game unto itself.
Yeah, it's one of those ones I've definitely wanted to get into, and even more so with kind of the spin-off into the Like a Dragon series. I think that might even be more my speed than Yakuza itself, but I'll get around to it eventually.
Yeah, the Like a Dragon Gaiden that was come out fairly recently that I feel like a lot of people are talking about. I see that everywhere. And you saw about Pal World. I just saw there was a Twitch Rivals competition the last couple of days talking about Pal World, and they had some competitions as far as that goes, where you had 3-person teams teaming up to compete. So it's huge. There's no question about it. I don't think it's going away anytime soon. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes from here. But Mike, your thoughts on games that you've been playing currently, either new or old games?
Yeah, I do think kind of going back to Pal World, it's tough sometimes when you look at some of the models of the creatures to not draw comparisons to Pokemon. I think that's inevitable. But at the same time, I think a lot of the outrage kind of stems more from just the amount of innovation and gameplay that they offer you that maybe some of the more established franchises like your Pokemon just have failed to capture up to this point. They kind of feel like retread over and over again, where this feels like a much more expansive experience.
It's the Madden NHL franchise type thing with EA Sports, where you buy one and you feel like you're good for the next 5 or 6 years, because until they change systems where there's a noticeable upgrade in graphics, you feel like you're getting the same game just reskinned every year. And it's like, why am I going to spend $70 on the newest version of that game when I've got this old game from 2 years ago, which is perfectly still fine? I feel like Pokemon, while they have had their moments, certainly you mentioned Pokemon Go, well, it was certainly something that was outside the box, but at the same time, the criticism is valid that it does kind of feel like the same game, and they're going through the motions a little bit. And you also understand it. Like, they've been making just a stupid amount of money. So it's like, if you're making a stupid amount of money by basically just giving you the same thing, slightly changed, well, why are you going to do anything else? But now maybe they'll lose some market share, and that's going to make them actually innovate for the first time in a long time.
I do kind of feel like people are starting to take a little more notice that it seems like with a lot of the AAA studios, maybe you're paying them more and not necessarily getting more in return. So I'm kind of curious to see how things go moving forward. I think like Skull and Bones that just hit, that was supposed to be some quadruple A title. And, there are people saying that Assassin's Creed Black Flag, which came out, like a decade before then, is actually a better game. So we're going to hit a breaking point, I think.
I think we see so many of these streaming games on Twitch that these streamers or VTubers or whatever are playing that are just indie type titles. They're not the most complicated games in the world, but they're super fun and they're cheap. Usually you can get them for a couple bucks and you can get just as much entertainment out of that. I think of a game like Buckshot Roulette. If you haven't had a chance to watch people play that, it's just a fun type of game. There's a little bit of strategy to it, but it's a game that I think you can get for just a couple of bucks, and it offers you lots of hours of streaming enjoyment and doesn't, break the bank too. So I think we're going to see more of those titles really compete for the time and attention of streamers and gamers compared to these big $70 releases that maybe don't live up.
Yeah, I would agree.
Even when you have these games that are more on the expensive side, your Baldur's Gate, your Helldivers 2, I think what's kind of set them apart from some of these churning and burning yearly release games is that these companies are making games that they want to play.
Yeah.
And that translates well to the audience.
Yeah, 100%. Like, that's, to me, if I was making a game, I want to make something that I enjoy playing too. I don't want it just to be something that is for somebody else. Like, if I don't enjoy it, why is anybody else going to want to play it?
Yeah, it kind of makes me think of years ago when the company behind EverQuest was going to launch this brand new, the third iteration of EverQuest, essentially, this EverQuest Next. And they had crowdfunding campaigns, and you could buy this kind of world building game that was kind of going to feed into the real game. And they went months and months and months. And then eventually they canceled it and said we basically couldn't make something that was fun. It's like they put all this time and energy and money into it, and the game just wasn't fun. And I think you're seeing a lot of these big games that they're spending so much money, and the end result just isn't appealing to the gamer. And I think that's a problem.
Yeah, no question about that. Something to keep in mind when you're spending all that money developing these games is that people have to actually want to play it. And you get a few copies out there and people don't like it. That may be the end of all that money and time and effort, and not in a good way. Mike, let's circle back around to some of the games you've been playing recently.
Yeah, I mean, kind of like Chris, I've been kind of delving more into some of the back catalog. I've been trying to make my way through the entire pixel remaster of Final Fantasy. So I'm about 10 hours into Final Fantasy VI now, which sometimes I forget just what kind of a step forward that was from Final Fantasy 4 and 5. I don't foresee it ever getting the Final Fantasy VII Super Remake treatment, but it would be really cool if they did do something to even take it further. Been wanting to get into Persona more. I bought Persona 3 Reload. I have Persona 3 FES on the PS2, kind of debating which one of those two I actually want to go through. Persona 4 on Switch as well. Beyond that, I'm kind of just waiting for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I haven't finished Remake yet, so maybe I'll try to get a little further in it first, but that's kind of what's on the plate right now.
Yeah, really good stuff there for sure. Definitely looking forward to the Final Fantasy one is obviously really interesting when that comes out. We're going to talk more about some things that are coming out and some things that you two want to play when they come out on the other side of this break, when we talk about some upcoming releases, some things that are on your radar, and then we will talk about a new subscription service that Mike has signed up for. We'll talk about those on the other side of this time out here on the Nerdcast Empire. Back on the Nerdcast Empire video game edition. Don't forget, tomorrow we'll have Music Monday once again. We've certainly been enjoying bringing you Music Monday each and every week. And this week we're going to be looking at the releases from February the 23rd, I believe will be that release date, if I have my dates right. So that'll be coming up tomorrow on Music Monday on the Nerdcast Empire. And then we'll be getting into having a weekly show on Thursdays as well. We'll talk anime and video games. Be looking on the lookout for that coming up in the next couple weeks here on the Nerdcast Empire. Let's talk about some of those games that are coming out soon. We'll start with Chris and some things that maybe you've already mentioned. We'll kind of recap them again, but some things that are coming down the pike that maybe you want to play, or maybe even some older titles that you haven't played but would like to maybe pick up at some point.
A little bit closer as far as games that have already been released. I know Mike mentioned Persona 3 Reload, and I've made it through my entire life without playing a Persona game or a Shin Megami Tensei game. So I really need to check out any of those. Persona 3 would probably be the best one to jump into with it just having released on Game Pass for me. Helldivers 2 is getting a ton of pop. I wish it was coming to Xbox, but I still may get it on PC just to check it out. Who doesn't love a game representation of Starship Troopers? I mean, going back to Yakuza, we did have a recent release, Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth. So I definitely need to get through my playthroughs of the original game so I can make it to that. And if I had to pick one to end on, buddies of mine have been wanting me to look into buying the Outlast Trials. That's another game that comes out in March. I played through the series a long time ago when it first released. A great horror game, all through of a camcorder, essentially. It's kind of like your Resident Evils or Silent Hill style horror. So I was really into that. I'm interested to see what this brings to the table, as it's one of those isometric multiplayer experiences. Been a while since I've got some of my buddies online to play a horror game, right, since Texas Chainsaw Massacre was released. So hopefully that'll get us back together.
Yeah, it sounds like a really interesting group of games there, and some overlap with some of the things Mike had mentioned. Mike, upcoming games that either you want to play that are coming out. We already mentioned a couple, but maybe even some older titles you still want to get into.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I mentioned Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. That was definitely one. A couple of the upcoming ones, there was a game, Rise of the Ronin, that was shown on the most recent Sony State of Play, and just a really cool period piece of feudal Japan. You kind of get to go through some historic battles, and it looks like they're really emphasizing the various sword styles with the character, and you can get some cool inventions like kind of makeshift flamethrowers and whatnot. I think that looked really cool. I've been looking for any kind of reason to get excited about my PlayStation VR 2 that I have. I feel like the games that they've released up to this point just haven't really appealed to me a whole lot. I played the Star Wars demo, which was kind of cool, but for the most part, it's just been collecting dust. But they did mention a game which actually came out February 8th that I haven't checked out yet, called Legendary Tales VR. And it kind of has that medieval setting to it. I just, the more I watch anime that involve these video games, I kind of want something equivalent in the real VR gaming experience. And I've yet to find it, but I'd like to try that one out.
Yeah, it sounds interesting. And you mentioned
Rise of the Ronin.
Right, seeing the trailer for that, it just really feels like that could be a massive hit. Like, it just looks great. It's a great time period to take to bring into video games, and a lot of successful franchises, both in video games and in anime, that'll come from that time. So that one looks like it has a ton of potential. Really interested to see if you pick that up and what that looks like.
Yeah.
But, good stuff coming up for both of you. Last thing I want to talk about this week is into the Nerdcast Vault, but it is an interesting trip into the vault. And you have recently signed up for a subscription service. I say new as in new to you, but it's been around a while, and it's an interesting take on some of these subscription services where you're kind of getting some, I don't want to say mystery items because it's not a total mystery, but at the same time, a chance to maybe collect some retro games that are more random than you just going to a gaming convention and picking up a specific title. Talk a little bit about this service.
Yeah, definitely. I've never really thought of myself as like the all-encompassing game collector. I don't just want to own every NES game that was ever created. That's my focus has always been way more narrow than that. But there is something to be said for getting that random, hey, what are they going to send me this month? And potentially making content out of the opening of the box and maybe streaming some of the random games to see if they're actually worth anything, since these are things that were big in my childhood that I most likely just didn't get in on, and it could be interesting. The service in question, Video Games Monthly, you pay a monthly fee and they'll send you 3, 4, 5, or 10 games depending on which plan you choose. The 10 games a month, 8 is $79.99.
Wow.
Plus shipping. Definitely not the one I went with. That's maybe a bit extreme. If I was going to drop $80, I would just go to my local game store and buy some random rare JRPG that costs that. But it's an interesting website. You go there and you set up your plan, and then they give you a list of systems that you can choose that they'll send you random games for. The systems I chose were Super Nintendo NES, Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64, Sega Genesis, Famicom, and Super Famicom. So It's going to mix in some Japanese games every now and then. So I'll be getting 5 games a month, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it sounds like a fascinating subscription service. I know we've talked about before, and maybe not on this podcast, but there was a time where you were getting the Pro Wrestling Crate.
Yeah.
And that's similar. In that case, you were getting 1 or 2 t-shirts, I think, and then you were getting a bunch of random items. It feels like this is a better deal in a lot of ways because you're going to get more things that you actually want, whereas those crates sometimes were full of stuff that's like, well, they're clearly just trying to get rid of this stuff. This is a case where you're not expecting to get a AAA title hidden in here. You're looking for things, or you're going to get things that you probably wouldn't even consider picking up on your own.
Yeah, for sure. I've seen some interesting things in some of the opening videos I've watched on YouTube as far as people getting, complete in box, like Sonic the Hedgehog 2 or something kind of random, but like in better condition or with the case that you wouldn't actually expect it to be, considering how old it is. It'll be neat because these are games that maybe I wouldn't mind owning, but would never actually make the conscious effort to buy them myself.
It's a lot easier to just randomly get it and then like, well, I'm going to try to play this now because I have it, as opposed to I kind of equate it back in the day when on the anime side, when New Type USA existed, you used to get a disc that had starter episodes. It would be the first episode of 4 or 5 series. Yeah. And I'll be honest, like, that was the smartest thing ADV could have done, because I don't know how many random ADV series I bought because I watched the first episode on a disc and thought, hey, this is pretty good, I'm going to buy it. It turned out that it was probably just fine. But this is a great way to pick up stuff that you would not even think about buying, or just would think, maybe I could buy this, but nah, I probably won't. I'll just get this other thing instead. Here, you're just going to get them sent to you. So it's kind of low risk, honestly. Although I would say, I think the price tag is a little high, but who knows? I mean, maybe you'll find it's worth it just to have the content, basically, like you said.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of my angle at it right now, is that there's a certain amount that I'm paying just for kind of the surprise of what I'm getting and what I could potentially do with what I get as far as unboxing videos and potentially streaming some of the games on the older systems. One other thing I don't think I mentioned is once you do set up that account, you actually go into it and they have each system set up where you can actually input which games you already own for those systems. Which for me, it varies depending on, I think I own maybe 3 Sega Genesis games currently, but you can do that and that'll limit the possibility that they'll actually send you a duplicate from one month to the next.
That makes me feel a little better about the price tag, because the one concern I would have is that you're paying $40 or whatever, and then you start getting a bunch of repeat games. At least this way,
8 copies of NES Golf. Thanks, guys.
Well, who would not want 8 copies of NES Golf? Maybe one of the greatest golf games ever conceived.
It is a classic.
Right along with some of the great other sports games from the NES, like ice hockey,
Blades of Steel.
Like, who wouldn't want multiple copies of that? But again, makes it make a little more sense from a price standpoint when you're not going to get duplicates. But interested to see when you get your first selection of those. We'll have to maybe talk about it here on the podcast as well and see how those turned out. But that's going to wrap things up for our gaming edition of the Nerdcast Empire. Again, don't forget to check out our website, nerdcastempire.com. You can check out our store there at nerdcastempire.com/store. Big thanks to Mike and Chris for joining me on the podcast this week. A big thanks to Stove Leg Media for all their continued support of the podcast. Don't forget Music Mondays coming up tomorrow. We're going to look at the releases from February the 23rd. Got some good ones on there. Make sure you check that out on Music Monday here on the Nerdcast Empire. That's going to wrap things up for this week. For the entire crew, I'm Matt saying so long. Don't forget to join the Empire, the Nerdcast Empire.